The radio crackled with a young man's prayer, and then there was only static. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita lowered his binoculars slowly, as if the weight of what he had witnessed pressed down on his arms. The bridge of the battleship Yamato stood silent around him. 65,000 tons of Japanese steel, the mightiest warship ever built, and every officer aboard had stopped breathing. Somewhere beyond the gray horizon of the Philippine Sea, 12 Zero fighters had climbed toward American carriers. Each plane carried a single 250-kilogram bomb bolted beneath its belly. Each pilot had written his final letter that morning, sealed it with steady hands, and walked to his aircraft without looking back. They were Tako pilots now. Special attack. One way, the date was October 25, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had reached its most desperate hour. American forces had returned to the Philippines, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled everything on this moment. Four separate fleet actions raged across hundreds of miles of ocean. And here, in the center of the chaos, Kurita watched the newest weapon in Japan's arsenal fail. Commander Hideo Yoshida stood 3 steps behind the admiral. His face showed nothing. His hands, hidden at his sides, trembled with a vibration he could not control. 6 months ago, Yoshida had served as a flight instructor at Chuchiura Naval Air Station. He remembered the names of every pilot in that morning's launch. He had taught 3 of them to fly. The first Zero had made it within 8 kilometers of the American formation before anti-aircraft fire found it. Kurita had watched through his binoculars as the plane shed a wing, spiraled, and struck the water in a fountain of white spray. No explosion. The bomb had not armed. The second pilot had tried to dive through a wall of tracer fire and disintegrated in midair, transformed into a shower of burning metal that fell harmlessly into the sea. The third had simply vanished into the smoke and confusion, never seen again. Of 12 aircraft, 9 had been destroyed before reaching attack distance. Of the 3 that dove on targets, 2 had missed entirely, plunging into empty water beside their targets. 1 had struck the escort carrier St. Lo, and Kurita had watched that small ship burn and sink. 1 success. 11 failures. The Americans sailed on. Their main carriers remained untouched. Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura stood at his station with a logbook open before him. His pen hovered above the page. He was 23 years old and still believed in the divine mission. The Tako strategy had been announced only days ago by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi in the Philippines. Onishi had promised that human-guided bombs would succeed where conventional attacks had failed. He had promised that the spirit of Bushido would overcome American machines. He had promised that the wind of the gods would blow once more, as it had blown in 1281 when typhoons destroyed the Mongol invasion fleet. Nakamura wanted to write something that would honor the dead pilots. He wanted to record the moment when the sacred wind began to blow. Instead, he stared at blank paper. Admiral Kurita finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. The wind does not answer prayers. Yoshida closed his eyes. He saw faces. Boys who had laughed at his jokes during ground school. Boys who had struggled with crosswind landings and celebrated their first successful carrier approach. Boys who had trusted him when he told them they were serving the emperor. Nakamura's pen touched the paper, then lifted again. He did not write the admiral's words down. Some things were too dangerous to record. The battle continued around them. Kurita still had a decision to make. His surface fleet had penetrated San Bernardino Strait. American escort carriers lay ahead, nearly defenseless. Beyond them, the transport ships and landing craft at Leyte Gulf. If he pressed forward, he might still turn the battle. He might still give meaning to the deaths of those 12 pilots, but Kurita had watched the sky fill with American planes all morning. He had seen the future of naval warfare, and it did not include battleships. It did not include honor or tradition or divine intervention. It included only mathematics. Numbers of planes. Numbers of pilots. Numbers of bombs. Japan was running out of all 3. At AT-1236, Kurita gave the order to withdraw. The greatest surface fleet Japan would ever assemble turned away from its objective and retreated through San Bernardino Strait. Historians would debate his decision for generations. Some would call him a coward. Others would say he saved thousands of lives by refusing to throw them away in a battle already lost. On the bridge of Yamato, Yoshida finally spoke. "Sir. What do we tell Tokyo about the TACO results?" Kurita did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had aged a decade. "Tell them the sacred wind blew. Tell them it was not enough." The static continued on the radio. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, 11 young men drifted toward the bottom of the ocean, still believing they had served with honor. They had. It simply no longer mattered. The fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped in glass, and beneath them, the most powerful men in the Imperial Japanese Navy sat in silence, surrounded by numbers that spelled their doom. Admiral Somu Toyota pressed his palms flat against the table. The wood was cold. Everything in the Hiyoshi underground complex was cold. They had carved this bunker beneath Keio University's campus, 60 feet below the earth, safe from American bombs. But no concrete could protect them from the truth that glowed on the charts before them. November 1944. 1 month since the TACO program had officially begun. 1 month of sacrifice. The telegrams had arrived throughout the morning, each one a small death. Rear Admiral Toshiyuki Yokoi read the figures aloud. His voice was flat, mechanical, stripped of emotion because emotion had no place in mathematics. 335 TACO sorties in the past 30 days. 27 confirmed strikes on enemy vessels. Effectiveness rate, 8.06%. The room did not move. Somewhere above them, Tokyo continued to burn from nightly beat, 29 raids. Down here, in the silence and the cold, the officers of Combined Fleet Headquarters absorbed numbers that made mockery of everything they had been promised. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi sat at the head of the table. He was 53 years old, and he had invented the Kamikaze. In October, standing before exhausted pilots in the Philippines, he had wept as he asked them to become living weapons. He had promised their deaths would save Japan. He had promised the Americans would lose their will to fight when faced with such resolve. Now he listened to the mathematics of his creation, and his right hand gripped his uniform trousers beneath the table until the fabric threatened to tear. Yokoi continued. He was a logistics officer, a man who dealt in fuel consumption and supply chains and maintenance schedules. He had no gift for rhetoric. He simply told the truth. At current attrition rates, we lose approximately 300 trained pilots per month. Our training programs produce 150. The deficit compounds. By February, we will have exhausted our reserves of experienced aviators. By spring, we will be sending men into combat who have never completed carrier qualification. Toyota raised a hand. What are American losses? Yokoi consulted his papers. 12 ships sunk. Approximately 400 sailors killed. Our intelligence estimates suggest morale impact has been minimal. They have adjusted their defensive formations. Destroyer pickets now extend 40 miles from carrier groups. Our pilots are being intercepted before visual contact with primary targets. The silence returned. The fluorescent tubes buzzed their insect song. Onishi finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of a man defending his own child from accusation. Faith cannot be measured in percentages. These numbers reflect physical outcomes, not spiritual impact. The Americans fear our pilots. They fear the resolve of men willing to die. This fear will erode their confidence over time. Toyota turned to face him. The commander of the Combined Fleet had served through Midway, through the Philippine Sea, through every disaster of the past 2 years. He had stopped believing in spiritual impact when American dive bombers sank 4 fleet carriers in a single morning. Onishi. If the divine wind fails to achieve strategic results, what remains? The question hung in the artificial air. Every officer in the room understood its implications. If kamikaze attacks could not stop the American advance, nothing could. The home islands would face invasion. The emperor would face surrender or destruction. Onishi's hand finally released its grip on his trousers. He placed both palms on the table, mirroring Toyota's posture, and leaned forward. Then we become the wind ourselves. Every ship. Every plane. Every man. We do not accept that mathematics determines history. We do not accept that material advantage guarantees victory. The Americans count bombs and bullets. We count hearts willing to sacrifice everything. Yokoi opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. What could logistics say to faith? Above them, the air raid sirens began to wail. Another formation of B-29s approaching from the Marianas, from airbases that had been Japanese territory 6 months ago. The bunker shuddered slightly as anti-aircraft batteries opened fire somewhere in the distance. Toyota stood. The meeting would continue in the shelter within the shelter, the innermost room where even direct hits could not reach them. Prepare plans for expanded TACO operations, he said. Include surface vessels. Include submarines. Include any weapon that can carry a man to his target. He paused at the door and looked back at the charts, at the red pins marking American positions that crept closer to Japan each week. We have asked our young men to become gods, he said quietly. The least we can do is witness what happens when gods fail. No one recorded his words. Some truths were too heavy to preserve. Cherry blossoms fell like pink snow across Kanoya Air Base, and Admiral Mato Mugaki walked among them toward the flight line where 23 young men waited to die. It was January 1945. Mugaki had arrived in Kyushu 2 weeks ago to assume command of the 5th Air Fleet. He had promised Tokyo results. He had promised the emperor that American ships would burn. He had promised himself that he would find meaning in this new kind of warfare, this transformation of pilots into missiles. Now he stood in the cold morning air and looked at the faces before him. They were children. Some had not yet begun to shave. Their flight suits hung loose on thin frames, evidence of the food shortages that gripped all of Japan. Each wore a white hachimaki headband with a red rising sun at the center. Each had tucked a small Japanese flag into his pocket, close to his heart. Mugaki was 60 years old. He had served in the Navy for 4 decades. He had been Admiral Yamamoto's chief of staff when American bullets cut down the architect of Pearl Harbor over Bougainville. He had seen friends die at Midway, at Guadalcanal, at a dozen battles whose names would fill history books. None of it had prepared him for this. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi stood beside him, managing the operation. Inaguchi had not slept in 3 days. His eyes carried shadows that no rest could cure. He had stopped counting the pilots he had sent out. He had stopped reading their final letters. If he allowed himself to see them as individuals, he would not survive. Mugaki stepped forward and addressed the assembled men. His speech was short. He spoke of honor, of duty, of the divine mission to protect the homeland. He told them their spirits would become guardian deities, forever remembered at Yasukuni Shrine. He told them Japan was grateful. He did not tell them what the intelligence report said. He did not tell them that American radar now detected incoming aircraft 60 miles out. He did not tell them that Grumman Hellcat fighters would intercept most of them before they ever saw a ship. He did not tell them the mathematics. When he finished speaking, he walked down the line and shook each pilot's hand. Their fingers were cold. Their grips were strong. One boy, no more than 19, smiled and said he was honored to meet the admiral. Mugaki felt something crack inside his chest. He kept walking. The pilots climbed into their Zeros. The ground crews had worked through the night to make them ready. Petty Officer Saburo Miyamoto, the senior mechanic, had supervised every inspection. He stood now at the edge of the flight line, watching engines sputter to life, watching propellers begin to spin. Miyamoto had stopped learning the pilots' names. In September, he had known every man who flew. He had shared cigarettes with them, heard their stories about girlfriends and families and dreams for after the war. By November, the turnover had become too fast. Now he simply called them pilot and focused on their machines. The machines, at least, he could keep alive. the 23 aircraft taxied to the runway in pairs. Ogaki watched them take off into the brightening sky, their wings catching the first gold light of sunrise. They climbed toward the south, toward Okinawa, toward the American Fifth Fleet. For a moment, they looked beautiful. For a moment, Ogaki could almost believe. By noon, the reports began arriving. Inaguchi brought them to Ogaki's quarters, where the admiral sat composing haiku by candlelight. It was his daily practice, his attempt to find beauty in a world that had gone mad. 19 aircraft lost before reaching the target area, Inaguchi said. Engine failures. Navigation errors. Intercepted by enemy fighters. 4 aircraft reached attack positions. Results? 3 missed their targets. Water impact. 1 struck a transport ship. Minor damage. The ship remains operational. Ogaki set down his brush. The ink was still wet on his latest poem, something about winter winds and distant mountains. He looked at Inaguchi and saw a man being slowly crushed by invisible weight. The Americans have learned our patterns, Inaguchi continued. They position destroyers in picket lines. Our pilots see the destroyers and attack them, believing they are larger vessels. They never reach the carriers. The candle flickered. Shadows moved across the walls like ghosts. Ogaki reached into his desk and withdrew a photograph. It showed a young naval officer in dress whites, smiling at the camera. His son. Dead at Midway. Dead believing his sacrifice meant something. We have created a ritual of dying that achieves nothing but dying, Ogaki said quietly. The ceremony has become more important than the outcome. The death more sacred than the result. Inaguchi said nothing. There was nothing to say. Outside, the cherry blossoms continued to fall. In Japanese poetry, they symbolized the beautiful brevity of life, the nobility of accepting death with grace. Ogaki had loved that symbolism once. Now he watched the petals drift across empty flight suits laid out for pilots who would never return, and he understood that beauty could become a lie. He picked up his brush and continued writing. The battleship Yamato moved through gray water toward her death, and Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito stood on her bridge watching the sky fill with kamikaze aircraft that would never reach their targets. April 7, 1945. Operation Tengo. The mightiest warship ever built had sailed from Tokuyama with only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. Her orders were impossible: beach herself on Okinawa and fight as a stationary fortress until her ammunition ran out. Everyone aboard knew they would not survive. The question was only how many Americans they could take with them, but even as Yamato plowed south, hundreds of Tako aircraft were launching from bases across Kyushu. This was Operation Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemums. Mass kamikaze waves designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had promised that quantity would succeed where quality had failed. Ito watched the results through his binoculars. American Hellcats and Corsairs swarmed the sky like blue hornets. They had learned to climb above the Japanese formations and dive through them, guns blazing, breaking up attack runs before they could organize. Ito saw zero after zero fall burning into the sea. He saw pilots attempt to reach their targets and fail within sight of salvation. He saw courage meet mathematics and lose. His chief of staff, Captain Tamichi Hara, stood beside him with a radio report. Fleet headquarters confirms, of 350 aircraft launched this morning, fewer than 30 reached attack positions. Effectiveness rate, 2.8%. Ito absorbed the number. 2 months ago, the rate had been 8%. Last month, 5%. Now less than 3%. The Americans improved faster than Japan could adapt. Every tactic Onishi invented, they countered within weeks. We have asked our young men to become gods, Ito said, still watching the distant slaughter. Instead, we have made them fuel. Hara did not respond. There was nothing to add. An hour later, American dive bombers found Yamato. The attack lasted 2 hours. The ship absorbed 12 bomb hits and 7 torpedo strikes before rolling over and exploding with the force of a small atomic blast. Ito went down with his ship. He never knew that his final comment would be preserved by a surviving officer, would be written in journals and quoted in histories, would outlast the empire he served. 4 months later, on a hot August night, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi sat alone in his office in Tokyo. The atomic bombs had fallen. Hiroshima. Nagasaki. The emperor had made his decision. Tomorrow, his voice would crackle through every radio in Japan, announcing surrender. The divine wind had blown and blown and blown, and achieved nothing but the multiplication of grief. Onishi took out his ceremonial knife. He wrote his final note by candlelight. The words came slowly, each character drawn with the careful precision of a man who knew these would be his last. To the young men who died following my orders, I apologize from the depths of my soul. I ask you to forgive me for sending you to your deaths without achieving our goals. Your sacrifice was pure. My strategy was flawed. I alone am responsible. He continued writing. He wrote about the mathematics that had haunted every meeting, every briefing, every sleepless night. He wrote that the Tako attacks had not changed the outcome, had only multiplied the sorrow. He wrote that he should have opposed the strategy rather than invented it. Then he picked up the knife. He died slowly, refusing assistance, insisting that his suffering was necessary penance. It took him 15 hours. His final words, whispered to an aide who could not save him, the spirit was willing. The numbers were not. On August 15, hours after the emperor's surrender broadcast, Admiral Mato Mugaki put on his dress uniform at Oita Air Base. He removed his insignia of rank. He climbed into a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, squeezing into a space designed for a single crewman. I am going to follow my men, he told the assembled officers. 11 pilots volunteered to fly with him. Their aircraft lifted into the evening sky, banked south toward Okinawa, and disappeared. None were ever seen again. No American ship reported an attack that night. The sea kept its secrets. Igaki's final radio transmission reached Oita as the sun set. I alone was not enough. The war ended. The Tako program died with it. 4,000 pilots had sacrificed themselves. They had sunk approximately 50 Allied ships, killed nearly 5,000 sailors. And they had changed nothing. The invasion they sought to prevent never came, made unnecessary by atomic fire. The empire they died to protect surrendered unconditionally. What remained were words. Comments made by admirals who watched from bridges and bunkers and airfields. Comments recorded by aides, preserved in diaries, passed down through generations. The wind does not answer prayers. We have asked our young men to become gods. We have created a ritual of dying that achieves nothing but dying. I alone was not enough. History would debate their choices. Future generations would study their failures. But the comments endured, evidence that even those who sent young men to die understood, in their private moments, the terrible mathematics of sacrifice without meaning. The admirals knew. They always knew, they simply could not stop.